Danger Dolan. From major cities with extra floors and levels scrapped before live release to early plans for player housing, we count 15 crazy facts about the early pre-release days of World of Warcraft.
Number 15.
Now, back before the art teams had designed the purple and green instance portals we know today, they used the old Blasted Lands Dark portal as a placeholder for the entrance to some dungeons. In fact, there was one particular portal in underwater Azshara that led many to presume an underwater raid was inevitable, but later on it disappeared, either a random addition or the long dead chance of an Azshara raid.
Number 14.
During early WoW development, the team had plans for an epic flying undead raid called Naxxramas, but in the meantime, they didn't know where to dump the floating necropolis placeholder. Inside the dungeon Stratome, near the end where you fight the final boss, there's a locked gate. If you glitch your way inside the gate, you're gonna find a half-textured, miniature version of Naxxramas. Evidently, they'd planned raiders to find the raid entrance inside the dungeon, just as the entrance to Molten Core is inside Blackrock Depths. But they scrapped it, and instead Naxxramas wound up floating above Eastern Plaguelands until it was moved to Northrend in Wrath.
Number 13.
Ironforge was originally designed to be the biggest city in the game. Instead of one circular floor, there were multiple floors and staircases until it was all squished down, since the devs realized it was just too confusing. Gnomeregan was intended to be a full-fledged capital city for gnomes, just as Ironforge was for dwarves, even with an elevator that led straight from Ironforge to Gnomeregan. But since the trolls didn't have a capital city, Blizzard decided to turn Gnomeregan into a dungeon, otherwise there would be faction imbalance.
Number 12.
Once upon a time, hunters could use almost every weapon, but even further back than that, they were supposed to be able to wear a type of shield known as a buckler. When bucklers were removed in favor of just one type of shield, both hunters and rogues could no longer use it either. And though some shields in the game have the title buckler, there's no longer any type of stat or class restriction difference to differentiate them.
Number 11.
Most people who played vanilla through Wrath remember that two leveling zones were particularly terrible, Azshara and Silithus. But did you know that technically they weren't even complete? Blizzard too late realized they'd accidentally designed Azshara with an inefficient questing layout, and they thought players would hate it so much that they actually stopped making quests and instead left most of it for the Cataclysm revamp. Silithus didn't even have a single quest at the game's launch, nor did mobs drop loot, and the only flight path was near the entrance to Ungoro Crater. They had to fix all of this later just to get the game out the door.
Number 10.
Before WoW released, there was an extra profession known as survival skills used to make campfires and torches. These torches were used in zones like Duskwood. Back then the intention was to have a zone so dark that you couldn't see a few yards in front of you unless you carried a torch to illuminate the landscape. Since it didn't feel right, Blizzard scrapped this feature and just gave zones a dark tinge instead of complete obscurity. But a lot of NPCs in Duskwood still carry torches, whether as a nod or because Blizzard couldn't be bothered taking them out of the game, we can't be sure.
Number 9.
Since Taurens were always a bigger race, Blizzard never took into account that they might not be able to fit into certain places and doorways. We saw this when Taurens couldn't fit through the Molten Core entrance window, and when female Tauren were so tall that they couldn't get through most of their doorways. They were also supposed to be too big to ride mounts. Instead, they had an ability called Plains Running, sort of like a Worgen's Running Wild seen today.
Number 8.
Before battle masters appeared in major cities, you had to actually physically move yourself over to the battleground entrance in order to queue up. That means you need to be in North Barrens for Warsong Gulch, Hillsbrad for Alterac Valley, and Arathai Highlands for Arathai Basin. Likewise, for quite some time, it was possible to wall jump behind Warsong Gulch and hide there with the flag for the entire game. If the enemy team did the same, the match would possibly last for days and weeks until someone disconnects or gets bored.
Number 7.
Back before Cataclysm, Blizzard took a lot of shortcuts when it came to coding and world design just to speed up development. In an area not easily accessible by players over the hills to the west of Dun Morogh, there existed a hut and dock known as Newman's Landing, which, if you visited, would show up as unknown when someone shift-clicks your name in chat. For a split second, you can see level 1 Alliance characters appear in Newman's Landing before they vanish. This is because when a new character is created, this is where the character is dropped before the opening cinematic plays for them. hence the term New Man.
Number 6.
Back when the WoW landscape was first getting built, the developers wanted to make each town huge and sprawling, the cities especially so. Goldshire was meant to have a considerable amount more buildings, but they realized that they couldn't possibly make all starting zone hubs that big, so they downscaled it. You can actually see a bigger version of Goldshire in this screenshot from one of the early builds of WoW. Likewise, player housing was meant to be included in these starting zones before it was tested and scrapped, since it really didn't have a purpose at the time. This idea would later be replaced by tillers farming garrisons.
Number 5.
At one point, trolls could do a Joker emote about killing dwarves that alluded to smoking weed. Nobody really knows how it made it into the game, but Blizzard removed it after the complaints rolled in. And before female trolls were given any concept art or in-game models, Blizzard reskinned male trolls with a female coat of paint, leading to this hunched monstrosity. Now every time anyone complains about female trolls, people usually respond with, well, things could have been considerably worse.
Number 4.
In early WoW, you had 5 tiers of well-rested experience from logging out in a major city. You got the bonuses if you haven't played in a while, but there were also penalties. The more you play, the more your experience bar dips into fatigued and exhausted, effectively reducing your experience gain from killing monsters by 25 and 50%. Blizzard undid this when they realized it was making people not play their game, since people were unwilling to wait 4 hours in a major city just to be able to get normal experience gains back.
Number 3.
Classes were a mess back in early vanilla. Before WoW was released, Blizzard had the mindset that only warriors should tank, priests should be the best healer. Certain classes would have specific jobs for raids, and that was it. You would bring a druid for innovate, a shaman for battle res, an armada of paladins to continually rebuff the raid with 5-minute blessings, and nothing else. Min-maxing didn't exist. In fact, most people didn't even have a rotation, they just spammed buttons. Moonkins would run out of mana after a few spells, and hybrid classes would deal less than half the damage of pure DPS classes, providing you even had a viable spec option, which quite a few classes didn't.
Number 2.
Before Burning Crusade, the Tower of Karazhan stood in Deadwind Pass, much different than it looks today. More of a menacing spiked citadel with the present Kara design evident in the side sub-tower. When the tower was finally revamped, there was a flight path nest and griffin on the upper terrace originally planned to be used as a way to access the side door and later bosses in the Karazhan raid to save people time, but for unknown reasons the flight path was never used.
Number 1.
There were multiple instances and unused assets in Stormwind since it was one of the first zones built in the engine all the way back in 2001. Here you can see an early incomplete version of Stockades with a different design. Some data mining actually indicates that it was supposed to be another dungeon in the city or potentially a raid called the Stormwind Jail. And the blocked off portal near Old Town was supposed to be used for instance player housing. Deep Run tram was supposed to take you to Darnassus before Ironforge took over, since it would make no sense for a tram to be built underneath half the world and wind around the maelstrom just because players didn't want to fly. Also, I have one more amazing WoW fact to show you. Just look at this.
I need both hands for my weapon.